Hello and welcome to Quadcast, Quadrant Chambers weekly discussion forum looking at news, hot topics and legal developments in the world of commercial litigation. The format is very simple. Drink, talk, chat. Drink. We invite you to join us for a delicious drink. I must admit I am simply drinking a glass of water because I'm in the middle of an arbitration and a bit under pressure at the moment. Talk, we're going to talk about a legal topic. This week it's good faith and the concept of the relational contract. And chat, we want you to join in. Send us your messages. You can email them in at quadcast@quadrantchambers.com. You can chat along on YouTube if you're signed into YouTube. We want to get you involved. But first up, news. Poonam, what's your news? What have you been up to this week?
Well, as you know, because I've had to ask you and Joe for lots of advice, I had my first outing to the Chancery Interim Applications Court, which is like the old-fashioned, thank you, Court 10. You all gather there at the same time, and then the judge decides what order he's going to hear it all in. So I was being very sniffy about this concept, but actually it was all incredibly efficient, including with remote hearing.
When you say it's efficient, does that mean you went first?
Yes. And he gave me a fixed time to come back again. And I'm back there tomorrow and I've got a fixed time of 10 o'clock. So yes, it was all very good. And thank you for your help, Joe. How's your week been?
Absolute pleasure. Yeah, good. This week, my daughter has gone back to nursery, which is sort of sad in a way, but also pretty transformative in terms of actually being able to do work. It's like suddenly I'm working on easy mode, which I'm still sort of just getting used to all this time. But as I say, also very sad. How about you, Claudia?
Well, on sad, I've been quite glued to the news after seeing the horrific, well, not just the news, but footage of the killing of George Floyd, and just watching events unfold since then. I think all the officers involved have now been charged, and we will, I guess, see how it develops. Paul, do you have better news?
It's a difficult one to answer.
Paul's been stuck in arbitration for the last 2 weeks, so probably not is the answer.
I agree. Shocking images. No, I've just been stuck in this this arbitration, which finishes tomorrow, which is great. So I can just move on and get on with the rest of my life. But anyway, look, this week we're talking about good faith in commercial contracts. And I think we're going to kick off with you, Joe, aren't we, and talk about Yam Seng?
Yeah, so I'm really the starting point in all this is Mr. Justice Leggatt, as he then was, decision in Yam Seng, which was reported in 2013. It was a case about a contract to do with a range of products marketed under the Manchester United banner, which is a very bad start as far as I'm concerned.
I think that's the one thing we've agreed on this week, actually.
Yeah, it's fragrances.
Tell us the range of products, because the range of products are worth
Well, it's all sorts of different things. I think, the scent of Alex Ferguson and stuff like that. But anyway, this contract went badly wrong, and there were all sorts of different breaches that led to litigation. But the interesting part of the case was that it was pleaded that there was an implied term in the contract of good faith, which had been breached. And Mr. Justice Leggatt found the existence of that term, a term of good faith and fair dealing. And he acknowledged that it was the first case where that notion had been addressed in detail as a matter of English law, and that in the textbooks there was considerable doubt as to whether there should be any possibility of implying a term or a duty of that sort in commercial contracts. But he said that if there wasn't this concept in English law was really swimming against the tide, because it's found in civil law systems. You see it in the US, you see it in Australia, even to an extent in Scotland. And he found that an implied term of this sort can simply be implied as a matter of the application of the ordinary tests for the implication of a term. And he said, well, when you look at the modern authorities about the construction of contracts, there is an emphasis on unspoken assumptions and norms of behavior. One of which, he said, is the assumption and the norm that commercial parties will behave honestly. And he said he looked in particular at what he called relational contracts where there is a long-standing relationship with substantial investment by both parties. And in those sorts of contracts in particular, one is likely to see, according to Mr. Justice Leggatt, this sort of an implied term. Now, Poonam, you've been looking at a later case.
Yeah, so I have to say, when Yamseng came out and I read it, let's declare right now I'm a good faith skeptic. I read it and thought, new judge trying to make a name and make law. And
he'll never go anywhere, you said, didn't you?
Quite, yes. And in the cases after that, people referred to it as masterly, interesting, and so on. But it didn't take huge traction in the case law. But I think things have really changed since the 2019 case of Bates and the Post Office. Thanks for giving me that one, guys, because it's 300 and something pages long. It's something to do with the dispute between the post office and sub-postmasters, but I haven't got time to tell you the facts. But in this case, Fraser J. goes through the authorities and says, you know what, in law, there is something called a relational contract. And also, when you find a relational contract, then as a matter of law, there will be an implied obligation of good faith. So he does it that way around. And what he tries to do is help you with what a relational contract is. And he gives 9 points, he says, which are not exhaustive, and I'm going to try and run them through you very, very quickly to try and help you identify what a relational contract is. The first one is that there mustn't be an exclusion of the good faith obligation. And that is right and clear, because if you have an exclusion, you can't imply the term. So that one is determinative. 2, it needs to be a long-term contract. But what's long-term? Do we mean 1 year? Is that long-term? 5 years? 15 years? Don't know what it means. Long-term. 2, there has to be that the parties intended, 3, intention of integrity and fidelity. 4, there has to be collaboration between the two parties. They're going to be working together in some way. 5, and this comes from Yamseng and from Mr. Justice Leggatt, says it has to be a contract where it couldn't all be written down. The spirits and objectives were not, or perhaps could not, all be written down. And we'll be talking about length of contracts later. 6, there has to be an intended a relationship of trust and confidence. Quite how that's different from 3 of integrity and fidelity we can think about. And then the next one is the contract needs communication and cooperation. Penultimately, and Joe mentioned this as well, significant investment. One or both parties need to have put in a lot of money towards the joint long-term aim of this contract. And finally, there may or may not be exclusivity. I hope I'm going to take those all down now, take one last look at them, and I hope that's made it all really clear for you when you're going to see a relational contract. I mean, Mr. Justice Fraser actually said that those 9 things I listed for you were very specific characteristics. I can see some of them, but how you discern that there was an intention of integrity, fidelity, trust, and confidence, if these parties aren't using these words and aren't actually saying we have an obligation of good faith, I'm not quite sure how it's specific to be able to find those. But anyway, after Bates, I've certainly seen that what people have been doing is actually pleading. So this was a relational contract between the parties, and so there's an implied term of good faith. And I know one of our viewers very kindly put in a question to us even before we started, Joanna Ullman of Holman Fenwick Willen, thank you. She said, well, can a long-term commodity sales contract be a relational contract? In my view, but everyone can shout at me later or now, no, because although it's long-term, it won't have many, if any, of the other characteristics I said. So I think it's unlikely, but people are arguing that charter parties are relational, oil and supply contracts are relational, all just focusing on the long term. Anyway, moving forward from Bates, there has, because I'm a good faith skeptic, been, in my view, a slight restoration of the position. In a Sheffield United case that Paul featured in, we won't say which side, the judge there respectfully disagreed with the approach taken in Bates and said, let's not ask, is it a relational contract first? Because what does that mean? It means different things to different people. You must always start with the contract, look at the express terms, look at the standard test for whether you find an implied term, i.e., is it necessary to make the contract workable, or would the official bystander say, and do it that way. And it's the wrong way around to do it the way it was done in Bates. That's been followed in a 2020 case. And just to round up and show how much good research I've done, I found 4 cases since Bates where people have argued implied term because relational, and in all 4 the judge said no. So, Claudia, what do you think about good faith and how it works?
Well, I think it's probably not that controversial to accept that there are certain categories of commercial relationship which will involve specific shared values, norms of behavior, which aren't accounted for by mainstream contract theory. And Leggatt recognized these, and Fraser identified, he used this label relational to the kind of relationship where there might be these norms. But I actually think it even might be right to say that an officious bystander would recognize these norms as ones which parties would hope or even expect the other party to follow. And the parties themselves might say that it goes without saying that they would adopt these behaviors. And I use officious bystander, or so obvious it goes without saying, because these are the classic tests for implying terms in fact. But I think Leggatt's analysis was too simplistic, and there's a risk that he may have led the law into error by assuming that either the officious bystander or the parties themselves would say, oh, of course, these behavioral norms should be incorporated into the contract as legal obligations. So in Yam Sen, he said there are these certain norms which are naturally taken for granted by the parties when making any contract without the need to spell it out. And I don't necessarily disagree with him, but I don't think that in itself means those norms should be incorporated. So Poonam's like saying that she's struggling with this idea of what is it relational, is it not relational, how can you tell? I saw this in an analogy, it's not mine, it's Robert Gordon's, and it was used in a paper that's quite good by Dory Kimmel. A one-off contract is a one-night stand, a relational contract is a marriage, right? So Poonam, I think you've got is it your 20th, your 25th wedding anniversary coming up?
25th.
25th, right? So I picked on you last time, so I figured it's fair to pick on you again. You're the relational contract paradigm. You're coming up to 25 years of marriage. One night stands, actually now illegal probably because of coronavirus. So let's imagine that I had a one night stand before they became illegal. This imaginary one night stand, which is fictional, my life isn't that interesting, could be contrasted to Poonam's marriage. And if you're saying, okay, classify any relationship, is it Claudia's fictional one-night stand or is it Poonam's marriage? Probably you're going to find it doesn't neatly categorize into one or the other, right? These things are a spectrum. And I think that's the issue with Fraser's approach, by saying you have to be able to say whether it's relational. But take a marriage. There are certain shared norms of behavior which you might expect, and which the officious bystander might say, oh, of course, it's so obvious, it goes without saying that married people will try and be faithful. They would expect honesty. They would love each other. I don't think it's so obvious that they would say, oh, yeah, it's so obvious it goes without saying that these are legal obligations. And I think we do recognize that there can be norms of behavior which everyone accepts, but which aren't legal obligations.
Why shouldn't they be?
They shouldn't be, right? So Poonam might value her husband's fidelity more if she didn't know that she got it, because every time she saw a twinkle in his eye, she rushed off to court and got an injunction that said he's absolutely not allowed to see anyone, right? You may think, some people would say, yeah, no, his fidelity probably means more if it hasn't been enforced by way of an injunction. And actually, the way that the state can support this kind of relationship is by taking a hands-off approach. And Dory Kim thinks that a similar thing could apply in a relational contract. And I don't think Leggatt even considered that possibility, right? That these parties might have
a difference. There's a difference between a marriage and a commercial contract.
Sure, there is, but there's also a difference between an accepted norm of behaviour and a legal obligation.
That's where the difference
fact that parties might recognise that they have these shared norms doesn't mean that they expect to be contractually bound by them, right?
But why shouldn't the law expect that? What's the reason?
You don't. That's the wrong approach. You're looking at it backwards. If you're looking as to whether a term should be implied, you're not saying why shouldn't it be. You're saying
I'm not looking at the legal analysis. I'm looking at the policy. Why is a matter of policy? Whether you do it by implied term or some other reason, why isn't that something that's desirable?
Because these woolly, loose words. I mean, we haven't even touched on what we say the duty of good faith involves. It's not just acting. It's not just you can't be dishonest. You've got to somehow have the interests of your other contracting party in mind, even though somehow it doesn't mean they have to be subservient to yours. It's all pretty woolly. Bates, 21 implied terms, all from this woolly good faith notion. And it's very difficult to have these implied and see how they work alongside either the rights you have expressly or also implicitly under the legal system.
I also think if you think they're good, you can put them in your contract because I
don't have any difficulty with these concepts at all. To my mind, it's perfectly straightforward. What Leggatt J was saying in Yanseng is that we have, as a matter of the construct of English law, we have two types of contract. We have ordinary commercial relationships, and then we have fiduciary relationships. And they're quite extreme. And he's just saying there is this middle class where you don't have to subvert your interests to the counterparty to the extent of a fiduciary relationship, but equally, it's not a sort of a cut and thrust, hard-nosed commercial deal. There are reasons why you have to take into account their interests and act in good faith. And it carries with it issues like not concealing important matters from the duty of disclosure, fair dignity. It seems to me that it's what we're seeing in the judiciary is we're seeing a polarization. We've got progressive judges like Fraser J who are embracing this, and I hope will win over and it will develop. And you've got the conservative judges who are saying no. If it's not obvious, it's not necessary. You don't get your clause, and will not recognize
the established test for implying terms, though, right? I think if you can't pass the normal test, you shouldn't get an implied term. I think you can still put it in expressly, but I think it's wrong to say, a relational contract, you can't legislate for everything, therefore you have to imply it. So in this Amy case, Amy Birmingham Highways, that Lord Justice Jackson was considering a 5,000-page document. There were lever arch files full of stuff, and they didn't have an express duty of good faith. They had one, if a dispute arises, negotiate in good faith before suing the hell out of each other. So you might think, well, they could as well have put in, shall act in good faith in all ways. So do you not think that...
But isn't that just the argument that if you've got a long contract, there should be no implied terms? And we know that that's not right, is it?
Well, that Supreme Court in Marks and Spencer's did pretty much say the longer and more drafted the contract is, the harder it will be to imply a term. So I'm not sure.
It's likely, but not impossible.
But Jackson...
I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying that it shouldn't be implied as a matter of law, and that you should satisfy the usual tests for implying in fact. Whereas I think Paul's advocating a slightly looser approach.
No, I'm not. I'm saying that if you have a relational contract, the good faith obligation is obvious and is necessary. But if, as a judge, you say there is no such, if you say there's no such thing as a relational contract, then you don't recognise the foundation for the obviousness of necessity.
No. Well, it depends. You can look at the contract, which is where you should always start, and you may find in it lots and lots of things about the relationship, the aims, how they're planning to do it all, and everything else that make you conclude that on the standard old-fashioned Supreme Court test for an implied term, one has certain implied terms to make it work. But that is different, and it would be quite rare, in my view. But that is different from just giving this new badge of relational contract and saying, and guess what, every time you have that, then you have an implied term without looking at the terms of the contract and what else they've said.
Shall we look at a couple of case studies?
Because just before we do that, we've had a question in from Kushal Gandhi at CMS, who asks how the duty of good faith overlaps, if at all, with the Braganza duty. I don't know if anyone wants to deal with that.
Well, the Braganza duty is not to exercise a discretion or a power arbitrarily, irrationally, or capriciously, right?
This is the Sosima sort of line, isn't it?
And
but Leggatt actually uses that line of authority as support for this notion that English law recognises good faith type obligations.
So for me, between estoppel and having that is another reason why you don't need this great big amorphous good faith thing. But have we answered the question? Yes, it's not related, but you might have the Braganza duty in that, right? Before we go to the problem, Paul, I want to ask you all of you one thing. Because I've been discussing this with Richard Callan of Norton Rose. What do you feel, if you're like me and you're anti the good faith thing, about saying to your counterpart, you know what? I want a clause saying no implied duty of good faith, no duty of good faith.
Well, doesn't that rather make, I mean, I agree with you that it's just such a startling thing for someone to ask for, that it rather makes Mr. Justice Leggatt, as he then was, it makes his point, doesn't it?
Well, as Richard said to me, he said when he suggested this, he felt he was a bit of a pariah. But it seems to me that actually it would be a very good thing to say, you know what, I don't want some willy notion of good faith implied later. And if the other guy goes, why not? You can hammer out some express terms about what you agree on and what you don't agree on, and maybe give up on the whole thing because you know you're destined for litigation. But the way the law is now, I'd like to see parties properly considering it. The reason
that this exposes or supports the Yang Tseng approach is that, imagine the negotiation. So I say to you, I'm not keen on just a very woolly, ill-defined duty of good faith. But I'm not saying I'm going to act in bad faith. But what I want is something specific. So we're going to draft a clause that's going to cover the eventuality. So it starts off the clause saying no general duty of good faith, but the parties agree that, and we'll have specific clauses. And the problem with that is that in a long-term relationship where the parties have put a lot of trust at the outset into the relationship in form of investment and the like, they can't know all the things they're going to turn up. That's what Leggatt is saying. You can't legislate for every eventuality.
So instead, you imply 21 different terms into a contract that already... Anyway, we know where we both stand. Let's go to the problems, Paul. I've diverted you for long enough.
Okay.
Right. Joe.
So, our problem, which I think will hopefully be put up on screen. Yes. So it's a banking problem. We have a bank which makes representations that it's relational, that it's friendly, all of this sort of stuff. Persuades a customer to take an overdraft to it. The bank manager then gets a bit windy when COVID kicks in and he's worried about the bank's position. So internally he says, well, if I'm just going to wait until the account goes into credit and then I'm going to shut the thing down. It'll probably cause the business to go bust, but hey ho, we'll be okay. Sure enough, that is what happens. The business pays money in, goes into credit, and then the overdraft is shut down in accordance with the express terms of the contract. Is the bank in breach of any contractual duty of good faith? Poonam.
Well, you know what my answer is going to be. I mean, first of all, I'm not sure you've got a relational contract even on Paul's view, just because they say they're a truly relational bank. The bank, where is the investment into a joint collaborative process and so on? So I don't see you get there with a banking contract anyway. But assume against me I'm wrong. Is this a breach of the duty of good faith? They've got, the bank, as I understand it on this problem, the contractual right to call in the loan at any point. For me, it would be mad business sense, and the bank and this chap would probably lose his job to warn them not to send them the money. You want to end your facilities when the bank's in a good place, not a bad place. That's your right. That's the contract that's been done. This is quite a good example of the conflict that this implied duty of good faith, which here would be a duty of disclosure, right, Paul? To warn her not to put the money in because he's going to close it. For me, it's a good example of how the implied duty would conflict with what are your proper objectives in your business relationship and your rights. Claudia, are you going to agree with me, please?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I don't think it's a relational contract. And I think it's a real puffy advertising slogan to say, oh, we're a truly relational bank. They've got the terms of their contract. If they didn't agree anything specifically good faithy, especially after having all of this discussion about it, then I think they're stuffed. Of course, you know.
So do you guys think it was, if there was an express term of good faith, that would be a breach? Or do you think no term, and even if there is a term, no breach?
So the breach would be what? In failing to say that we are going to enforce our rights? In
having a secret plan about this nefarious plan. And
I don't think it's nefarious. I think it's a regular banking plan. I think they were fine.
I don't think it's a breach of the duty of good faith to call in a loan.
Right, let me ask you this.
Give us some sense, Paul. Come on.
Right, well, obviously the bank is going to win this one because banks always win these sort of arguments. So in that sense, I agree with Poonam and Claudia. I don't think the position is as straightforward, though, as they would make out. And I've got a question for Poonam to make my point. Okay, let's assume the bank manager, I think we're calling Mr. Sly, haven't we? Let's say that this has been a long-standing banking relationship such that he's told by head office to do this and he feels uncomfortable. He feels that it's morally wrong. So he phones up the customer and tips the customer off. And he's sacked for acting in breach of confidence to the bank's detriment and everything. And his defense is it wasn't because it was a long-term relationship. There was an implied duty of good faith. I was only doing what the bank ought to have done in those circumstances. Should he be able to be sacked in those circumstances, Poonam?
Yes, because he should have followed his head office's instructions or told them, I'm not going to do it and I'm not going to have any part of closing this account. That's going back to vicarious liability, but using an analogy, he went off on a frolic of his own. So
employment contracts are good faithy type contracts, aren't they? And he's supposed to be acting for his employer, not because he feels
mutual trust
bad for Mr. Fast Food.
It's not. I don't think it's exactly the same. But no,
it's not exactly the same. But it's
phones up and he says he phones up the Ms. Innocent and he says, "Look, you ought to know this. I'm very uncomfortable about what they're doing, but you need to know." I mean, I think that's him acting in good faith. I think it would be very harsh to say that he's acted wrongfully in that situation.
And so you're saying what, he should warn them so they don't pay the money in. They then serve a demand for the money.
Yeah, let's just be clear. The duty of good faith doesn't require the bank not to call the loan in, obviously, because
right.
within the express terms of the contract. The duty of good faith could rise to a duty of disclosure, i.e. they don't act to the customer's detriment by concealing that plan from the customer. They give the customer warning once they've made.
And you mean factual detriment here, because obviously they're in the same legal position. They still owe the bank the same amount of money, right? But they may have been able to evade their obligations in the first instance.
Okay, we've had a question, guys. So just let's help with what the duty of good faith is. Is it the same as the duty not to prevent the other party from performing? If not, can you imply a non-prevention principle, even if not a duty of good faith? My understanding is they're different. The non-prevention is narrow. And yes, I think certainly in some of the cases we've been discussing, they're so long I'm mixing them up, they refused to imply a good term obligation or did, but there was also an express no prevention principle. I think it was Bates, actually. So yeah, they are different and you can have the one without the other.
Yeah, definitely. Mackay and Dick won't undermine the basis of the contract. It's different to the duty of good faith, I think.
Claudia, have you got
I was going to say, my case study, before I sound like I'm too hard-nosed in business, this case study I think is one where people might be more comfortable implying good faith, because I think the other one just wasn't. So here we have Jones and Watts go into business together to set up ice skating rinks. They're 50-50 shareholders in the company. Their agreement excludes a relationship of partnership. So they've expressly agreed they are not partners. They're 50-50 shareholders in this ice rink. After the expiry of their 5-year term of the agreement, Global Leisure approaches John Jones, but not Tracy, and says, I'll give you 10 million for the business. Jones doesn't tell Tracy about the offer. He just says, oh, look, our agreement's about to expire. How about $1 million for the shares, knowing that he can sell the business for 10 million. So arguably her shareholding is worth 5 million. But he doesn't, because he doesn't tell her that, she accepts, he sells the business to Global Leisure. Is he in breach of a duty of good faith towards Tracy? And I think this one is, Poonam, let's see where your limits lie.
You know you all burnt my hair last week. You should be nice to me this week.
I'm not selling party this week, so I'm being nicer to you than I was last week. But I reckon the other two are going to say, I know what they're going to say. So I'm asking you.
Clearly that behaviour in that slide feels pretty shocking. And you'd have to be very hard-nosed black letter lawyer to say, gosh, they should get away with it. So there you can see the emotional heartstrings of saying that.
What about, so there's an entire agreement clause.
Oh, don't care about entire agreement clauses in this context, unless they are specifically saying no implied term. But the usual ones are about excluding collateral contracts and misreps before. They don't exclude implied terms. So
what about no partnership agreement?
That's okay. That's pretty common. It doesn't mean you don't have the duty of good faith. So this is where you knew at the end of the day you were going to make me eat my words of the whole Quadcast and go, yeah, I can see how it would happen. But, you know, I'd still like to see an express term in these sort of contracts delimiting what it is, because it is easy on those facts to say there's been a breach. I just don't think that's how it works in most cases. And I'm afraid a lot of the reason people choose is English law is for some certainty. And we shouldn't be going around making it all the more uncertain.
Those facts aren't a world away from another Mr. Justice Leggatt case where there was a sheikh who threatened to chop the hands off his business partner, or didn't. But he didn't disclose an offer and was found to be in breach of a good faith type duty.
The whole concept of implied terms is, you know, a bit woolly, and who's to say that the judge 10 years down the line isn't going to say, oh, I'm going to imply a term. I mean, there is uncertainty, but the beauty of English law is it's flexible and it's commercial in its outlook. And I think that's why it's attractive, apart from the fact that it's obviously very low, well, no corruption, obviously, of our judges and the like. So those are the sort of factors I think make England popular forum. There's always a bit of
that there is bordering on actual dishonesty, so you might get it a different way. So there's no fraudulent misrep, but
yeah, I don't know if you need to go as far as a fully formed good faith. I think you may be able to think about a narrower duty, as you say, Poonam.
Yeah.
On that heady advert for English law, Paul.
At least our judges aren't corrupt.
What are we doing? So next time, we're back in 2 weeks, everybody. We are going to do, so the plan is now we're going to do Quadcast every 2 weeks, right up until the end of July. And by which time, who knows, we may be off on summer holidays, maybe not. But we're going to do Quadcast every 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be doing Quadcast again. Who's going to tell us what the topic is? Claudia, do you want to say what the topic is? Do you remember what the topic is?
It's not just our judges that aren't corrupt. We would like to think our arbitrators aren't either. So we're going to have an arbitration workshop where we do talk about what may happen if you have an issue with your arbitrator, for example. But because we've got slightly longer, now we've got 2 weeks, we would like to invite comments, questions, case studies from you guys who are watching, right? So how arbitration interfaces with the court. If you have questions, stuff that comes up a lot in your practice, any case studies, send them in, and we'll tailor our show really around your input.
Yeah, so it's the interaction of the arbitral tribunal's jurisdiction and the court jurisdiction, whether that's before the arbitration kicks off with the Section 44 type application, or whether it's the application to remove an arbitrator or to appeal from an arbitrator. That whole interaction between the court's jurisdiction and the arbitral jurisdiction under the 96 Act. That's what we're going to look at in 2 weeks. So please get involved. Please send us your questions. The sooner you send them to us, the more easily we can work case studies and structure the program around your questions.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because the last question we had was, are we allowed to vote which advocate from the four of you we would choose to represent us?
No.
And be privileged to bench? And the answer is, we're going to all agree on this, people, is no. But thank you for the idea.
Thanks for the question. Now, I've totally lost my stream of thought now. We want you to get involved. So send us questions, comments to quadcast@quadrantchambers.com. Please do that in the course of the next week or so. And please subscribe. If you're watching this now, immediately sign on to YouTube and subscribe to Quadrant Chambers YouTube channel, because that way you'll get notification, not just of Quadcast, but any other webinars or seminars or programs that we put out. That just leaves it for me to say thank you very much to Emily Saunderson, our long-suffering producer, who sends us messages throughout the show, and Ben Jacobs, Fish Eyes Production, who's done the live broadcast and vision mixing. But with those words, thank you very much for joining us this week, and goodbye until next time.